Our next one is titled Mrs. Get Me Everything. OP says, so this evening my son said something that got me thinking and that honestly made me a little sad. So for a quick backstory, I have a 5-year-old son and a 6-month-old son. I exclusively breastfeed. I'm a forgetful person and our house isn't the most organized. My oldest son is a great helper. I try not to constantly be telling him to get me this or that, but typically it's a few times a day. Most commonly, I ask him to run upstairs and get a burp cloth if baby is throwing up all over himself and me. I ask him to get the boppy if I left it in a different room, and I ask him to bring me my phone. A lot of times, if it's something small like my phone, it's because I'm in the middle of breastfeeding and can't move, or I'm holding baby who has fallen asleep and I don't want to wake him. So this evening, I was laying with my son in his bed and we were talking about his day, which I often do to help him fall asleep. My son was moving around and being silly and it was getting late. I asked him to please turn out his light so that he would go to sleep since it was getting late. His response was, okay, Mrs. Get Me Everything. I was taken aback and instantly felt bad. I explained why I wanted him to turn the light out and asked if he felt I nodded him around. He said that he doesn't want to get me things sometimes. Then he seemed like he felt bad for saying it. I wasn't angry at him and didn't chastise him and said that he only feels bad when I don't say please. So long story short, I do plan to be more mindful of how I ask my son to get things and how many times. I don't think it's bad to ask for help, but I want to make sure it's not excessive simply because I'm tired and don't want to move. I'm not really asking for advice, but just kind of putting this out there because I feel embarrassed and because it felt kind of like a wake-up call because I'm constantly asking my son to get me this or that. I know that's normal to a certain extent, but I'm worried about going overboard. Anybody experience something similar? I don't know why, but his comment has me feeling really bad. Now, this one hits a bit close to home for me, actually, because this is exactly what my parents were like when I was a child. In terms of, I kind of want to say they treated us a little bit like sevens. And there were, we were 4 kids in total, so they had quite a lot of sevens for some period of time. I think that it's a bit of a complicated issue because there are 2 angles to it. There's the one angle of, hey, yeah, it's fair enough to ask your kid to do things that he doesn't want to do. And I would probably think of that mostly in terms of things like chores. You know, if he's doing household chores, if you ask him to clean up after himself, if you ask him to put his plates away after he eats dinner, if you are trying to teach him to wash dishes, whatever those chores might look like, I think that there is some element of parenting where, as a parent, you can impose things on your children that are necessary and important for them to learn how to do. And then there is this angle where it's like you don't appreciate or treat your kids as people. Instead, you kind of, I say as people, at the very least, you treat them kind of like servants, like they're little mini helpers who have no will or ability by themselves to say no, because they're just your children and you're the parent, and there's kind of a power differential there inherently. I am a very big fan of methods like Montessori. Montessori is a method of parenting and of teaching your children where you try to follow the child. It's kind of a child-led method of teaching where you follow the child's interests and you try to meet them at their level, and you teach them to be independent and self-sufficient, and you try to give them choices and to enable them to make decisions about their lives by themselves without necessarily having to rely on you for things that they can do themselves. And you'd be surprised to what extent babies can do things by themselves if you actually give them the chance to do it. And I'm a huge fan of that. And part of the aspects of Montessori that they really care about is things like practical life skills that would involve learning how to vacuum the floor, learning how to sweep, learning how to cook, learning how to clean, etc. And obviously there's an element of that feels a little bit similar in terms of you're making the child do things that maybe they are not naturally inclined to do. But that's actually already kind of against the idea of Montessori, because Montessori says that children are already interested in doing adult things. And so if you approach it from the perspective of, hey, I'm an adult trying to teach my child to do something that is important and relevant, and if my child isn't interested in that, then I'm not going to force him to do it, then I think the intentionality of that already completely changes the dynamic of this type of circumstance versus you're sitting on your couch and you're breastfeeding your baby, and the event that you're sharing with your child in this case is actually parenting the baby. And so he's there. I kind of when I read this, what I read is this is a single mom with 2 kids. Now, maybe I read it this way because there is zero mention of having any kind of partner. These are the types of things that I would ask my husband to do for me if I needed help out, if I needed help with something, especially when it comes to getting a burp cloth or whatever, getting diapers, etc. These types of basic things where you're like, hey, I'm with the kid, I really need some help for a second, then that's kind of where I would expect my husband to jump in and help out. Now, if my husband isn't around and you have other kids around, then I can understand why some of the time you'd want to rely on them. But what I think really triggers me about this is that the point that a kid feels like he is being used and exploited. And I say, I know exploited is a bit of a strong word, but I mean it in the sense that he's being used in a way that's for the good of the mother only. It's not in any way for his own good or in his own interest, in terms of learning how to do something. Then it's probably a sign that it's too much. So yes, I think that the biggest problem here is that the mother seems to be quite lonely, seems to have minimal support, and unfortunately it has manifested itself in this behavior towards the child that the child noticed, that the child vocalized a problem with. And the fact that when he called her out, she immediately knew, I'm probably overdoing it. That's a really good sign, but it also means that he's probably right. So I think that this is a behavior that as a parent, we should all be super aware of. I'm very worried about myself, actually, because like I said, this is something that I grew up with. And so I definitely have the tendency in me to be like, oh yeah, hey, maybe you can get me X, when I could just get it up and just get up and get it for myself without relying on anyone. But it is still a problem. It is still a problem that we should all deal with. Now, you'll see in some of the comments, people are actually think quite the opposite. Some people say, the first reply is, meh. Sometimes my 6-year-old will dramatically sigh and say, do I have to do everything if he's asked to do 2 things? I figure he doesn't really do chores and he doesn't have a lot of responsibilities, just going to kindergarten, so he can fetch things now and then. Usually he's polite and has a good attitude, and it makes me feel good knowing I'm raising a gentleman who is mindful of others and helps out. There's so many toxic grown men who expect their wives to mother them and never want to lift a finger. I don't mind breaking that cycle. It won't hurt your son to be told to help a lady out, even if a please is forgotten now and then. And this I kind of have a problem with, because actually I would say, hey, if you want to model good behavior to your son, you should model good behavior to your son, and being respectful, being grateful when he helps you out, saying things like please, like that's a pretty simple level of politeness that you should also model to him. So no, I don't think that the way to break the cycle is then to start ordering your son around and to take out what you perceive as having happened throughout history, or maybe what happens in your own relationship with your husband, that your husband doesn't help out so much. I don't think that you should take that out on your son and be like, yeah, I'm doing a good for society by teaching men to take care of women. That sounds like a little bit of a stretch. That's not how I would approach this. OP says, thanks for your reply. Since the baby was born, I've been worried about my son feeling bad and left out. You make some great points that I should keep in mind. I think the great point that this commenter made is, yes, it's good to give kids responsibilities and it's good to raise them to be good human beings. That's the focus. And then the question is, how do you do that? And I don't think the way to do that is just by asking them to get you things all the time without some consideration, without some understanding of the situation, the context in which you're doing that in. Next person says, meh, it is better he learn he's useful and be a member of the household who is expected to help out. It's not as if you're sending him down into the coal mines or having him plow the field. And there I would also say, yikes, that is not the comparison. I would not compare how I treat my child and then have the standard that I want to compare against be child slavery. Like maybe that's not the best possible comparison that you could take. I would rather take best possible parent and then compare myself against that standard rather than take the absolute worst way that I could treat my child and then say, well, at least I'm not doing that, right? OP says, so true. No. This is a terrible message. Yes, again, it is good to teach your kids that they can be useful and that they can be members of the household. It is good to involve them in chores. It's great to teach them how to do adult things like cleaning up or doing laundry or doing dishes, just looking after themselves. But it's really important to not do that because you want to take the work off your shoulders, because they can feel that. They know They will definitely know the moment that you shove things at them to do that you don't want to do yourself because you think that they suck and because you don't value them, because you don't think that they're a good use of your time, because you simply cannot be bothered, then they get that, you know, they will internalize that, they will feel it, that energy will be out there in the space as you try and get them to do these things, and they will always be reluctant and it will always involve some level of force. It's such a huge difference from looking for the things that they are curious about, trying to involve them in things that you're already doing, trying to nurture their interests and their curiosity and to make them better people through that. I hate when people make comments like this. This person says, I understand this because I'm currently going through the same thing. My son is 6 and his little sister is 2 months old. So I tell him, can you get this or do this a lot of the time? Sometimes I feel guilty before I ask him because I'm like, am I asking too much? Typically he doesn't complain, but I try to remember to say please and thank you. Also, I remind him sometimes that he's simply awesome for helping me out. I think it's good for them to learn to help others, but also we can show our appreciation, even if it's just little things they do. He'll complain about his little brother who's 2 years old doing such and such. So I'll remind him sometimes that when he was little, I did that for him. Or he did the same thing when he was his brother's age. So it all comes full circle with each kid. What do they say? Teamwork makes the dream work. That's a really sweet sentiment. And I think that it is good when you have older kids to try and create this kind of connection to their younger children, that they understand they're experiencing the normal circle of life, that the behaviors that the baby is exhibiting are the same behaviors that they had as children as well. The last comment on this thread says, my son acts like this sometimes and he's 11. I think maybe sometimes we forget that kids have feelings too. And it's nice to hear please when asked to do something. God, I very, very, very much hope that by the time I have an 11-year-old, I do not forget that kids have feelings too. I really, really hope so. That is a terrible note to end on. So in general, OP, I think it's great that the moment your kid responded in this particular way, you took the cue and understood that there is something here that you should watch out for. And in general, for all parents, it is not that it's bad to try and get your kids to help you out with things, but there is a huge difference between doing it with some intentionality and knowing what exactly you expect them to take from you, teaching them to do that thing, versus just pure laziness.